At the far northeastern corner of the contiguous United States sits Maine, a state that often feels both deeply American and distinctly separate from the rest of the country. It is part of New England, yet it stretches farther north and east than any other state in the lower 48. On a map, Maine looks like a broad wedge of forests, bays, rivers, and coastline, pressed between Canada and the Atlantic Ocean. It borders New Hampshire to the west, the Canadian provinces of Quebec and New Brunswick to the north and east, and the Gulf of Maine to the southeast. It also shares a maritime border with Nova Scotia. But one fact makes Maine especially unusual: it is the only U.S. state that borders exactly one other state. That geographic isolation has shaped its politics, economy, culture, and identity for centuries. Maine is the largest state in New England by total area, and it is almost as large as the other 5 New England states combined. But size does not mean crowding. Maine is among the least populous and least densely populated states in the country, and it is often described as the most rural state in the United States. As of 2024, its population was estimated at about 1.4 million, the highest estimate in the state's history, but still small compared with many states that occupy less land. Its capital is Augusta, a modest inland city on the Kennebec River. Its largest city is Portland, a coastal hub that has become central to Maine's modern economy, culture, and public image. This contrast between vast rural landscapes and concentrated coastal life is one of Maine's defining patterns. The physical geography of Maine is one of the main reasons the state feels so distinctive. Its Atlantic coast is not smooth and simple. It is jagged, rocky, and deeply indented by bays, inlets, peninsulas, and islands. This coastline helped create fishing villages, harbor towns, shipbuilding centers, and maritime trade routes. Inland, the state becomes increasingly forested, with mountains, lakes, rivers, and long stretches of sparsely settled land. The climate can be harsh, especially away from the coast, and historically that made farming and settlement more difficult than in some other parts of New England. Maine's landscape encouraged a culture tied to timber, fishing, navigation, seasonal work, and self-reliance. Even today, the state's image is inseparable from pine forests, cold waters, rocky shores, and small communities spread across a large territory. Long before Maine became a state, its territory was home to Indigenous peoples for roughly 12,000 years, beginning after the glaciers retreated at the end of the last ice age. These communities developed ways of living shaped by rivers, coastlines, forests, and seasonal movement. At the time Europeans arrived, several Algonquian-speaking nations governed the region. Today, these nations are commonly associated with the Wabanaki Confederacy, a group with deep historical and cultural connections across what is now Maine and neighboring areas of Canada. Any story of Maine that begins with European colonization skips thousands of years of human history. The region was not empty wilderness, it was a homeland with established communities, political relationships, trade networks, spiritual traditions, and knowledge of the land and sea. European attempts to settle Maine began early, but they were far from easy. In 1604, the French established a settlement on St. Croix Island under Pierre Duguay, Sieur de Mons. It was one of the earliest European settlement efforts in the region, but the environment proved extremely difficult. A few years later, in 1607, the English established the Popham Colony, organized by the Plymouth Company. It was short-lived, but it showed that England also viewed the coast as strategically important. During the 1620s, Irish and English settlements appeared along parts of the Maine coast. Yet many failed because of severe weather, limited supplies, isolation, conflict with Indigenous peoples, and rivalry between European powers. Maine's early colonial history was not a steady march of settlement. It was fragile, contested, and frequently violent. The 17th century was a turbulent period in Maine. The region sat at the edge of imperial competition between French and English interests, while Indigenous nations defended their lands, alliances, and autonomy. Settlements were vulnerable, and conflict repeatedly disrupted colonial expansion. By the time Maine entered the 18th century, only a small number of European settlements had survived. This matters because it helps explain why Maine developed differently from more densely settled parts of southern New England. Its colonial footprint remained thin for a long time, especially beyond the coast. The rugged environment and ongoing warfare slowed expansion and created communities that were often isolated from larger centers of power. Maine's later reputation for remoteness and toughness has roots in this era of fragile survival. During the American Revolution, Maine was not yet its own state. It was part of Massachusetts, but its distance from Boston made it feel politically and geographically separate. Loyalist and Patriot forces both contested territory in the region. Maine's ports, rivers, and coastline had strategic value, but the area was difficult to defend. This problem became even clearer during the War of 1812, when British forces occupied the largely undefended eastern region of Maine. Their goal was to potentially annex it to Canada through a proposed colony sometimes called New Ireland. Although the British occupation did not permanently change the border, it exposed how vulnerable and neglected the region could feel as part of Massachusetts. The war strengthened arguments that Maine needed more direct control over its own defense and government. Maine's path to statehood came in 1820, but it was tied to a much larger national crisis. For decades, many Mainers had wanted separation from Massachusetts, partly because of distance, local interests, and the feeling that decisions made in Boston did not always reflect life in the Northeast. Maine voted to secede from Massachusetts and become a separate state. But its admission to the Union became connected to the Missouri Compromise, a national agreement meant to balance power between free and slave states. Missouri entered as a slave state, while Maine entered as a free state. On March 15, 1820, Maine officially became the 23rd state. Its statehood was local in motivation, but national in consequence, woven directly into the growing sectional tensions that would later lead to the Civil War. After statehood, Maine's economy continued to reflect its geography. Forests supported logging, timber exports, paper production, and related industries. Rivers helped move materials and power mills. The coastline supported fishing, shipbuilding, trade, and later tourism. Maine's rural character was not simply a demographic detail, it shaped livelihoods and settlement patterns. Many communities remained small, spread out, and closely tied to natural resources. The state's low population density also contributed to a political culture that often values local control, independence, and outdoor life. While industrialization affected parts of Maine, especially mill towns and ports, large parts of the state never became heavily urbanized. This left Maine with a landscape where working forests, small towns, coastal harbors, and wilderness areas exist side by side. Maine's food identity is one of the strongest in the United States. The state is famous for lobster, clams, and other seafood drawn from the cold waters of the Gulf of Maine. Lobster in particular has become an international symbol of Maine, appearing in tourism ads, restaurant menus, and local traditions. But Maine is not only about seafood. It is also known for wild lowbush blueberries, a crop closely associated with the state's fields and barrens. These foods are more than marketing icons, they connect to real industries, seasonal labor, environmental conditions, and regional pride. Maine's cuisine reflects the meeting point of land and sea, fishing villages, coastal markets, blueberry harvests, and a food culture that turns local resources into a defining part of the state's image. In recent decades, Maine's coast, especially the areas around Portland and down East Maine, has become increasingly important to the creative economy. Portland, the state's largest city, has developed a reputation for food, arts, design, craft industries, and a high quality of life. This has attracted visitors, entrepreneurs, remote workers, and new residents. But growth has also brought tension. As Portland and its surrounding metropolitan area have become more desirable, housing costs and gentrification have become major concerns. The same qualities that make the city attractive, such as historic neighborhoods, coastal access, cultural life, and economic opportunity, can also make it harder for longtime residents to remain. Maine's modern challenge is not just attracting growth, but managing it without losing the communities that created its character. Maine is often summarized through simple images: lighthouses, lobsters, pine forests, rocky cliffs, and quiet towns. Those images are accurate, but they are only the surface. Maine is also a borderland, shaped by Indigenous history, French and English colonization, imperial warfare, American statehood politics, rural economies, and modern coastal change. It is large by New England standards, yet lightly populated. It is geographically isolated from other U.S. states, yet closely connected to Canada and the Atlantic world. It is deeply rural, but also home to a growing creative and urban economy. Understanding Maine means seeing how geography and history reinforce each other. At America's northeastern edge, Maine is not just a scenic destination, it is a state shaped by distance, resilience, and the constant pull between land, sea, and identity. If you found this helpful, please like this video and subscribe for more explainers.